What happened to Cher at 80 is not the kind of story that begins with silence. It begins with a voice that has survived changing decades, changing music, changing beauty standards, changing Hollywood rules, changing public opinion, and changing versions of herself. For more than 60 years, Cher has stood in front of the world as if she were made of glitter, leather, heartbreak, and steel. To some, she is the goddess of pop. To others, she is the woman who refused to disappear. But now, at 80, the question many people are asking is simple. What really happened to Cher? The answer is more emotional than most people expect. Because when people look at Cher today, they do not simply see an aging superstar. They see a living archive of American entertainment. They see the teenage girl who once felt uncertain, unwanted, and underestimated. They see the young woman who stepped into the spotlight beside Sonny Bono and became half of one of the most recognizable duos of the 1960s. They see the solo artist who had to fight for her own identity after the world tried to define her through a marriage, a television show, a costume, a punchline, or a headline. And they see something else too. They see time. At 80, Cher carries the strange burden of being both timeless and human. The public wants legends to remain frozen exactly as they remember them. They want the same hair, the same walk, the same energy, the same jokes, the same face on every magazine cover. But life does not work that way. Even icons wake up with memories. Even icons lose people. Even icons look in the mirror and understand that the years have taken something, even while giving something back. For Cher, the road to 80 was never smooth. It was built through reinvention, but reinvention is often just a beautiful word for survival. She had to survive the collapse of a public marriage. She had to survive being dismissed as a novelty act. She had to survive the cruelty of critics who thought her clothes were louder than her talent. She had to survive the industry's obsession with youth. She had to survive grief, family struggles, legal battles, and the heavy loneliness that can come when the applause stops and the dressing room door closes. But somehow, every time people thought the final chapter had arrived, Cher found another way back. In the 1970s, she proved she could stand alone. In the 1980s, she moved deeper into acting and stunned Hollywood, with performances that were far more serious than her critics expected. By the end of that decade, she had won the kind of respect that could not be explained away by sequins or spectacle. Then came the 1990s, and when many artists from her generation were being quietly pushed aside, Cher returned with Believe, a song that did not just become a hit, it became a cultural reset. Younger listeners who barely knew her earlier work suddenly knew her voice. Older fans watched her rise again. The world was reminded that Cher did not follow eras. She outlived them. That is why seeing her at 80 feels so powerful. Because her story is not only about fame, it is about endurance. There is something heartbreaking about realizing how many people from Cher's earliest years are no longer here. Sonny Bono, once her partner in music and marriage, is gone. Greg Allman, another complicated love in her life, is gone. Her mother, Georgia Holt, who lived long enough to see her daughter become a global institution, is gone. Friends, collaborators, rivals, producers, designers, and people who stood beside her during different chapters have all become part of memory. And yet Cher remains. That fact alone carries emotion. At 80, she is no longer just performing against the expectations of the music industry. She is performing against the expectations of age itself. Every appearance becomes a conversation. Every photograph becomes a judgment. Every interview becomes a reminder that the world is watching closely, trying to decide whether the woman who once sang about turning back time has finally been forced to accept that time cannot be turned back at all. But maybe that is the wrong way to look at it. Maybe the real tragedy is not that Cher grew older. Maybe the real tragedy is that the world still struggles to let women grow older without demanding an apology. Cher spent her life being called too much, too loud, too thin, too daring, too exposed, too emotional, too artificial, too honest, too old. But the secret of Cher's power is that she never built her life around being approved of. She built it around continuing. She continued when people laughed. She continued when the reviews were cruel. She continued when relationships ended. She continued when her body changed. She continued when the business changed. She continued when the industry seemed ready to move on without her. And now, at 80, continuing may be the most radical thing she has ever done. For fans who have followed her for decades, watching Cher today can feel emotional because it forces them to look at their own lives too. They remember where they were when they first heard, "I Got You, Babe." They remember watching her on television, seeing Bob Mackie gowns that looked impossible, hearing that unmistakable voice cut through the room. They remember her films, her interviews, her comebacks, her fearless one-liners. Cher's aging is not just Cher's aging. It is a mirror held up to everyone who grew up with her. And that is why this moment matters. Because at 80, Cher is not asking the world to cry because she is fading. She is asking the world to understand what it took for her to still be here. Behind the glamour is a woman who has been hurt. Behind the confidence is a person who has had to fight doubt. Behind the legend is someone who knows what loss feels like. And behind the jokes, the wigs, the gowns, and the immortal songs, there is a truth that becomes clearer with every passing year. Cher did not survive because life was easy. She survived because quitting never looked good on her. And as the world watches her at 80, one thing becomes impossible to deny. The most emotional part of Cher's story is not what happened to her. It is what she survived and still chose to become. For Cher, survival was never a quiet thing. Some people endure by hiding. Some people endure by shrinking themselves until the world forgets where to aim its criticism. But Cher did the opposite. Every time life tried to reduce her, she became larger. Larger hair, larger costumes, larger performances, larger risks. It was as if she understood something very early. If the world was going to stare anyway, she might as well give them something unforgettable to look at. But behind that fearless image was a woman shaped by insecurity long before fame ever found her. Cher's childhood was not built on stability. She grew up with uncertainty, financial pressure, and a sense that the world did not automatically make room for girls like her. She did not fit the clean, polished mold Hollywood often preferred. Her features were different. Her voice was different. Her presence was different. And in an industry that often rewards sameness, being different can feel like a punishment before it becomes a gift. That is what makes her rise so extraordinary. Cher did not become famous because she was exactly what the entertainment business was looking for. She became famous because she was impossible to ignore. When she stood beside Sonny Bono in the 1960s, there was something unusual about her. Not just her beauty, not just her deep voice, but the way she seemed both nervous and defiant at the same time. She was young, but she already had the look of someone who had been underestimated enough times to develop armor. At first, the world saw Sonny and Cher as a package. Their chemistry was real, their image was memorable, and their songs became part of the soundtrack of a changing America. But fame built on romance can become a cage. The public loves a couple until the couple becomes complicated. It loves the fantasy, but not always the human beings trapped inside it. And Cher was trapped in more ways than fans understood. The television smiles, the comedy routines, the matching image, they created a brand. But behind the brand was a woman slowly discovering that she wanted more than the role she had been given. She wanted control. She wanted independence. She wanted to be seen as more than someone's wife, someone's partner, someone's beautiful sidekick. She wanted her own name to mean something. That fight came at a cost. When her marriage to Sonny ended, it was not just a personal breakup. It was the collapse of the image that had made her famous. For many performers, that might have been the end. Audiences can be cruel when a familiar host changes. They do not always forgive women for stepping out of the roles that made them beloved. But Cher took the risk anyway. She walked away from the life the public thought it understood, and began the long, painful work of becoming herself in front of everyone. That is where the real Cher story begins. Not with the spotlight, but with the decision to keep standing in it after everything changed. The 1970s and 1980s became years of reinvention, but reinvention was not glamorous from the inside. It meant being doubted again and again. It meant trying to prove that she could sing without Sonny, host without Sonny, act without being mocked, and command attention without relying on the old formula. It meant entering rooms where people thought they already knew what she was, and proving them wrong. Hollywood did not make that easy. Cher was often treated as if her beauty worked against her credibility. Her costumes became a distraction for people who did not want to acknowledge her discipline. Her humor made people underestimate her seriousness. Her fame made people assume she had not earned her place. But Cher had something critics could not measure: stamina. She could take humiliation and turn it into fuel. She could take rejection and return with a sharper edge. And then came acting. For those who only knew her as a pop star, Cher's move into film seemed risky. Some expected failure, some expected vanity. But she gave performances that revealed something raw and grounded beneath the spectacle. She was not simply playing glamorous women. She was playing wounded women, working-class women, complicated women, women who carried pain without asking permission to exist. In those roles, audiences saw a different side of her. They saw that the dramatic eyeliner and extravagant gowns had never been a mask for emptiness. They had been armor over depth. Cher could be funny, sensual, strange, tough, and vulnerable, sometimes all in the same scene. And when Hollywood finally gave her serious recognition, it felt less like a surprise and more like a correction. Still, even success did not protect her from the personal storms. Cher's love life became public property in a way that few people could survive with dignity. Every relationship was inspected. Every man beside her became part of a headline. Every age difference, every breakup, every rumor became another opportunity for the public to decide who she was. For male stars, romance often adds mystique. For women, especially women as famous and outspoken as Cher, romance can become evidence used against them. But she refused to become ashamed. That refusal became one of her signatures. Cher never presented herself as a woman who had lived perfectly. She presented herself as a woman who had lived fully. She made mistakes. She trusted the wrong people. She stayed too long sometimes and left dramatically at others. She loved intensely, lost painfully, and spoke about it with a kind of bluntness that made people uncomfortable because it sounded too much like truth. At 80, all of that history sits behind her eyes. Every joke she tells now carries decades of survival beneath it. Every public appearance comes with the weight of all the younger versions of herself that had to fight to reach this age. The girl who did not feel beautiful. The young wife who wanted freedom. The divorced star trying to rebuild. The actress demanding respect. The pop legend reclaiming the charts. The mother navigating complicated family realities under a public microscope. The aging woman refusing to vanish. That is why Cher's story hits so hard now. Because when people say, "What happened to Cher at 80?" they may expect a tragedy, a shocking revelation, or a final sad chapter. But the deeper truth is more powerful. What happened is that Cher reached an age many stars never reach. With a legacy most artists never touch, after living a life that could have broken her many times. She reached 80 not untouched, not unchanged, and not without scars. She reached it as proof. Proof that reinvention is not about pretending the past did not happen. It is about carrying the past differently. Proof that aging does not erase beauty. It reveals what beauty had to survive. Proof that a woman can be criticized for 6 decades and still refuse to hand over the final word on her life. Cher's voice may sound different now. Her body may move differently now. Her life may be quieter in some ways than the wildest chapters that came before. But the essence remains unmistakable. That stubborn spark, that dry humor, that refusal to be neatly categorized, that strange and rare ability to belong to every era without fully belonging to any of them. At 80, Cher is not just a celebrity. She is a witness. A witness to what fame gives and what it takes. A witness to how the world celebrates women, then punishes them, then celebrates them again once they survive long enough to become legends. A witness to heartbreak, reinvention, loss, power, and endurance. And maybe that is why so many fans feel emotional when they see her now. They are not only seeing Cher, they are seeing the cost of becoming unforgettable. The cost of becoming unforgettable is that people stop seeing you as a person. They see the image first. The hair, the gowns, the voice, the attitude, the headlines, the jokes, the comeback stories. They see the woman who could walk onto a stage and make an entire room feel small beside her. They see the performer who seemed almost built for immortality. But what they often miss is the human being underneath it all. The woman who had to wake up the next morning after every triumph, every breakup, every insult, every loss, and continue living inside a body and heart that the public believed it owned. That has always been one of the saddest parts of Cher's fame. She became so iconic that people sometimes forgot she could be hurt. For decades, Cher used humor as both a weapon and a shield. Her sarcasm was quick, her timing was sharp, and her honesty could slice through the artificial politeness of Hollywood. If critics mocked her clothes, she came back bolder. If people questioned her choices, she answered with a joke that made it sound like she had already moved on. If interviewers tried to corner her, she turned the moment into a performance. But comedy does not mean pain is absent. Sometimes comedy is what pain learns to wear in public. Cher's life was filled with moments that would have overwhelmed a less determined person. She had relationships that ended under bright lights. She had business conflicts that forced her to fight for control. She had family matters discussed by strangers, as if love could be judged from a distance. She had to live with the strange cruelty of being worshipped one year and mocked the next. And through it all, she had to keep appearing as Cher, larger than life, bulletproof, untouchable. That expectation can become its own kind of prison. Because when you build your identity on strength, people rarely know what to do when you are tired. They admire your resilience so much that they forget resilience often comes from repeated injury. They praise you for surviving without asking what survival cost. They call you fearless because they never saw the private moments when fear was sitting beside you in the dark. At 80, those hidden costs feel more visible. Not because Cher has lost her power, but because time changes the way we understand power. When she was younger, power looked like a chart-topping song, a daring outfit, a sharp comeback, a stage entrance that made the audience gasp. Now power looks different. It looks like the ability to remain present after losing so many pieces of the life you once knew. It looks like showing up with history written across your face and refusing to apologize for being human. That is why her age has become such an emotional milestone. Cher turning 80 is not just a number. It is a confrontation with everything the entertainment industry tries to deny. Hollywood sells youth, as if youth is the only currency that matters. It treats aging as a quiet defeat, especially for women. It teaches audiences to expect female stars to either preserve the illusion of eternal youth or politely step aside. But Cher has never been polite about existing. She does not step aside easily. That refusal has always been part of her mythology. She never vanished just because a new generation arrived. She never let one career define the limits of another. Music, television, film, fashion, activism, memoir, interviews. She moved across formats as if the boundaries were suggestions, not rules. And each time people decided they understood her, she slipped out of that definition and became something else. But reinvention does not erase loneliness. That is the part fans often sense but cannot always name. Behind every new era of Cher was the possibility that she was starting again because something behind her had ended. A relationship, a professional chapter, a version of herself, an illusion. Reinvention can be glamorous when seen from the outside, but from the inside it often begins with loss. You do not reinvent yourself unless the old self can no longer carry you. For Cher, each transformation came with that kind of emotional weight. The young folk pop star became a television personality. The television personality became a solo survivor. The solo survivor became a serious actress. The serious actress became a dance pop phenomenon. The dance pop phenomenon became an elder icon, whose presence alone could make headlines. Each version looked bold, but each one also required a goodbye. At 80, she stands with all those ghosts. The girl in the fringe vest, the woman in the Bob Mackie gown, the Oscar-winning actress, the mother, the lover, the divorcee, the punchline, the comeback queen, the activist, the legend. None of those versions disappeared. They are all still there, Layered inside the woman, the world now watches with a mixture of admiration, nostalgia, and concern. And perhaps that concern is what makes the story so emotional. Fans see her age and feel protective, not because she is weak, but because they know what she represents. Cher is one of the last remaining figures from a certain golden era of popular culture who still feels connected to the present. She is not simply remembered, she is still discussed. She is not only a symbol of the past, she still enters the current conversation. That is rare, and rarity creates fear. People do not want to lose what cannot be replaced. Cher cannot be replaced. There may be other powerful female performers. There may be other voices, other costumes, other reinventions, other dramatic lives played out in front of cameras. But there is only one Cher, because Cher is not just a performer. Cher is a timeline. Through her, people can trace music history, television history, fashion history, Hollywood history, celebrity culture, gender politics, and the shifting meaning of female power. That is why her presence at 80 feels almost impossible. She has outlasted trends that once seemed permanent. She has outlasted critics who dismissed her. She has outlasted industry executives who underestimated her. She has outlasted the idea that a woman's public life should have an expiration date. And somehow, after all of that, she still carries the same essential message she has always carried, whether through a song, a film, a red carpet look, or a single raised eyebrow. I am still here. Those 4 words may be the emotional center of Cher's entire life. Not because staying is easy. Not because fame protects anyone from heartbreak. Not because time is kind. But because there is a particular kind of courage in continuing to exist loudly when the world keeps trying to make you quieter. At 80, Cher's story is not a simple tragedy. It is not merely sad, and it is not merely inspirational. It is something more complicated. It is the story of a woman who gained everything people dream of: fame, money, awards, influence, admiration, and still had to face the same human truths no one escapes: loss, aging, regret, love, memory, fear, change. That is what happened to Cher. Life happened. And somehow, even after all of it, she remained unmistakably herself. And being unmistakably herself may be the greatest victory Cher ever achieved. Because the world never stopped trying to edit her. From the beginning, people wanted to decide what Cher should be. When she was young, they wanted her to be softer, sweeter, easier to package. When she became famous, they wanted her to stay inside the image that first made her popular. When she became independent, they wanted her to explain herself. When she became bold, they called her outrageous. When she became older, they expected her to retreat. But Cher never seemed interested in becoming easier for anyone to understand. That was not always comfortable. There is a price for refusing to be simplified. It means people misunderstand you on purpose. It means they turn confidence into arrogance, vulnerability into weakness, reinvention into desperation, and survival into spectacle. Cher knew this better than almost anyone. She lived under a level of public inspection that could turn an ordinary decision into a headline and a private wound into entertainment. Still, she kept choosing herself. That choice is what gives her story its emotional force at 80. It was not just that she became successful. Many people become successful. It was that she managed to remain recognizable to herself after fame tried to take ownership of her identity. She became a brand without fully surrendering her soul to the brand. She played the game without letting the game completely define her. And yet, the loneliness of that kind of life cannot be ignored. Fame surrounds a person with people, but it does not always create intimacy. There are assistants, managers, stylists, lawyers, producers, photographers, reporters, fans, and strangers who feel entitled to a piece of the person behind the name. But real closeness is harder. Trust becomes complicated. Love becomes complicated. Even friendship can become complicated when a person's life is attached to power, money, access, and mythology. For Cher, this was especially true because her personality made her seem invincible. People expected her to have an answer for everything. They expected her to be funny, sharp, glamorous, and defiant every time she appeared. But no one can be a legend every hour of the day. No one can carry an entire public identity without feeling its weight. There must have been moments when Cher was not the goddess of pop, Not the comeback queen, not the Oscar winner, not the fashion icon, just a woman sitting with her memories, wondering how so much time had passed. That is the part that makes people emotional now. Because at 80, the distance between the young Cher and the present-day Cher feels enormous. The world has changed beyond recognition since she first stepped into the spotlight. Music has changed, fame has changed, technology has changed. The way people consume celebrity has changed. There was a time when Cher's image moved through television screens, vinyl records, magazine covers, and movie posters. Now her legacy circulates through clips, memes, streaming platforms, documentaries, social media posts, and younger fans discovering her in fragments. But somehow the fragments still connect. A teenager might find a video of Cher performing in the 1970s and understand immediately that she had something rare. A film lover might watch Moonstruck and realize that her acting was not a side experiment but a serious gift. A pop fan might hear Believe and recognize a sound that changed dance music forever. A fashion student might study her red carpet looks and see the blueprint for every celebrity, who later used clothing as a declaration of identity. Cher is everywhere, even when she is not trying to be. That kind of legacy is powerful, but it can also be heavy, because once a person becomes a symbol, the world keeps asking them to represent something. Cher has represented freedom, glamour, rebellion, survival, camp, heartbreak humor, female independence, queer resilience, and artistic reinvention. Different people look at her and see different things. For some, she is the soundtrack of youth. For others, she is the proof that a woman can age without disappearing. For others still, she is the embodiment of refusing shame. But symbols do not get to rest easily. They are carried by the public, but they are also used by the public. People project onto them. They demand meaning from them. They expect them to remain strong, because the symbol has helped them feel strong. Cher's greatest gift to fans may also have been one of her heaviest burdens. She made survival look glamorous. But survival is not always glamorous. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is painful. Sometimes it is simply waking up after another loss and deciding not to let that loss become the final definition of your life. Cher's survival was covered in sequins and stage lights. But beneath the glitter was the same hard human work anyone has to do when life changes without permission. And life changed many times. She watched eras end. She watched people she loved leave, either through separation or death. She watched her children grow under public attention. She watched her own image become a subject of debate again and again. She watched the culture that once mocked her later celebrate her, and she learned the strange truth that public opinion is often less about justice than timing. Some people are not understood until the world catches up. Cher was one of those people. The very qualities that once made critics dismiss her eventually became the qualities that made her legendary. The bold fashion became visionary. The deep voice became iconic. The refusal to act her age became empowering. The reinventions became evidence of artistic intelligence. The emotional honesty became part of her connection with fans. What was once called too much became exactly enough. That is why seeing her at 80 feels less like watching a star fade and more like watching a prophecy fulfilled. Cher always seemed to be telling the world that women did not have to obey the rules written for them. She said it through her clothes before everyone had language for it. She said it through her career moves before reinvention became a marketing strategy. She said it through her relationships before the culture became more willing to discuss female desire and independence. She said it through her humor before vulnerability became fashionable. And now her life says it in the simplest way possible. She is still here. At 80, that phrase no longer sounds like a boast. It sounds like a confession. A confession that the road was harder than people knew. A confession that the glamour did not erase the grief. A confession that even the strongest women get tired. A confession that time takes from everyone, but it does not take everything. Cher's story at 80 is emotional because it reminds us that legends are not born from perfection. They are made from endurance. They are made from falling apart privately and returning publicly. They are made from being misunderstood, copied, criticized, adored, abandoned, rediscovered, and still refusing to become small. And for Cher, the final lesson may be this: she did not need to turn back time. She needed to survive long enough for the world to understand what she had been showing it all along. What Cher had been showing the world all along was not just glamour. It was defiance. Not the loud, empty kind of defiance that exists only to provoke attention, but the deeper kind, the kind that grows out of being told no too many times. Cher's entire public life can be read as a series of refusals. She refused to be ordinary. She refused to be quiet. She refused to be trapped inside a marriage, once the marriage no longer gave her freedom. She refused to let critics decide the limits of her talent. She refused to disappear when youth was no longer on her side. And perhaps most importantly, she refused to become ashamed of the very things that made her different. That refusal became her legacy. But legacies are strange. They look clean from a distance, almost inevitable, as if everything had to happen exactly the way it did. But when you are living the story, nothing feels inevitable. Cher did not know in the hardest moments that they would someday become proof of her strength. She did not know that the jokes made at her expense would one day sound foolish. She did not know that the outfits mocked by critics would be studied by fashion historians and copied by younger stars. She did not know that the voice people once called unusual would become one of the most recognizable sounds in pop culture. She only knew she had to keep moving. That is the part of her story that often gets buried beneath the mythology. People talk about Cher as if she was always destined to become Cher. But destiny is easier to believe in after someone survives. In real time, she faced uncertainty like everyone else. She had career fears. She had personal doubts. She had failed plans, broken relationships, and chapters that did not unfold the way she wanted. The difference was that Cher had an almost supernatural talent for turning endings into entrances. When one door closed, she did not simply open another. She kicked it open wearing something unforgettable. That image is funny, but it also reveals something true. Cher understood performance as power. She knew clothing could be armor. She knew humor could disarm judgment. She knew silence could be mistaken for weakness, so she often chose blunt honesty instead. She knew that if the public was going to create stories about her, she had to create an image strong enough to compete with those stories. Still, image could only protect her so much. Behind the stage lights, there were moments no costume could fix. The death of Sonny Bono in 1998 was one of those moments. Their relationship had been complicated, sometimes painful, and far from the fairy tale fans once imagined. Yet grief does not wait for relationships to be simple. When someone has shaped your life so deeply, their absence echoes through every version of who you became. Cher's public farewell to Sonny revealed something many people had forgotten. Behind the jokes, the history, and the distance, there had once been a bond that changed both of their lives forever. That kind of grief does not fit neatly into headlines. Neither did the grief of losing her mother, Georgia Holt, decades later. Georgia was more than Cher's mother. She was a link to the beginning, to the girl before the fame, to the private history no audience could fully understand. Losing a parent late in life can be disorienting in a way outsiders often underestimate. Even when you are grown, even when you are famous, even when you are surrounded by admiration, the death of a parent can make the world feel suddenly colder. It can make a person feel like the last witness to certain memories. At 80, Cher carries those absences. She carries the people who loved her, the people who hurt her, the people who left, and the people who helped build the woman the world now calls a legend. Every stage of her life has been marked by someone standing beside her and then, eventually, not standing there anymore. That is the hidden sorrow of longevity. To live a long life is to collect proof of survival, but also proof of loss. And yet Cher's public identity has rarely allowed much room for softness. The world likes her strong. It likes her sarcastic. It likes her fierce. It likes her in command. It likes her as the woman who can make a comeback look effortless. But emotional strength is not the absence of softness. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who have learned to reveal softness only in carefully chosen moments, because they know how easily the world can exploit it. Cher's softness often appears in flashes, a trembling voice during a memory, a joke that arrives just before a painful truth, a pause in an interview when the past comes too close, a look that suggests the answer is bigger than the question. These small moments matter because they remind us that the legend is not separate from the woman. The legend is what the woman built in order to survive being seen. That is why the phrase "try not to cry" feels less like a warning and more like an invitation to look deeper. Do not cry because Cher is old. Do not cry because time has passed. Cry, if you must, because a girl who once seemed unlikely to conquer Hollywood somehow became one of the few people in entertainment history who truly did. Cry because the world tried to reduce her to a costume, a voice, a marriage, a joke, a comeback, a body, an age, and none of those reductions were big enough to hold her. Cry because she endured, and because endurance, when seen clearly, is always emotional. At 80, Cher represents something that cannot be manufactured. Modern fame can create visibility overnight, but it cannot instantly create depth. It cannot create decades of risk, reinvention, public failure, private recovery, cultural impact, and emotional scar tissue. It cannot create the kind of authority that comes from having been dismissed by one generation and revered by the next. Cher's authority was earned the hard way. She earned it by being mocked and returning, by being underestimated and returning, by being heartbroken and returning, by being told her moment had passed and returning with another moment, by standing inside the cruel machinery of fame and somehow keeping enough of herself intact to laugh, sing, act, love, mourn, and continue. That is what happened to Cher at 80. She became more than a star. She became evidence that a life can be messy, painful, excessive, misunderstood, and still magnificent. She became evidence that aging is not the end of relevance when the soul behind the image remains restless. She became evidence that glamour, at its deepest, is not about looking untouched by life. It is about looking life directly in the face and saying, "Even now, you do not get to finish my story for me." And that may be the most powerful thing about Cher at 80. She still owns the ending. For most stars, the later years are written by other people. Critics begin using words like legacy, as if the person is already gone. Fans become nostalgic. The industry becomes polite. Interviews become softer, more focused on the past than the present. The world starts treating the artist like a museum piece, something to admire from a respectful distance, but no longer expect to surprise you. Cher has never been comfortable inside a museum. She belongs to the stage, to movement, to contradiction. She has always been too alive for the neat glass case that people try to build around legends. Even now, when the public looks at her through the lens of age, she resists becoming a frozen symbol. She remains unpredictable. She can be tender in one moment and brutally funny in the next. She can speak about grief, then turn around and make a joke sharp enough to remind everyone that the old fire is still there. That fire matters. Because aging in public is one of the hardest performances any celebrity can give, especially a woman whose image has always been connected to beauty, sensuality, fashion, and power. The camera is not gentle, social media is not gentle, strangers are not gentle. Every wrinkle, every outfit, every movement, every relationship, every public appearance can become material for judgment. People who could never survive 5 minutes under that kind of scrutiny feel free to comment on a woman who has survived it for more than 6 decades. But Cher has never asked the world to be gentle with her. She has asked for something harder. She has asked to be taken as she is. That demand has followed her throughout her life. Take me with the voice. Take me with the costumes. Take me with the mistakes. Take me with the lovers. Take me with the surgeries, the rumors, the sarcasm, the vulnerability, the contradictions. Take me as a woman who did not come here to behave according to rules written by people who never had to live my life. At 80, that message becomes even more urgent, because the world still does not know what to do with older women who refuse invisibility. It praises them when they age quietly, gracefully, and modestly. It uses the word grace as if it means shrinking without complaint. But Cher's version of grace has always looked different. Her grace is not quiet submission. Her grace is survival with attitude. Her grace is continuing to be vivid when the culture expects you to fade into beige. That is why she remains so important. She gives people permission to imagine aging differently, not as a slow surrender, but as another form of self-possession, not as a disappearance, but as a continuation, not as an apology, but as a statement. Cher has never pretended that time does not exist. She knows better than anyone that time takes things. But she also seems to understand that time can reveal things too. It reveals who was built on novelty and who was built on substance. It reveals which stars belonged only to their moment and which ones could travel beyond it. Cher traveled. She traveled from 1960s folk pop to 1970s television glamour, from variety show fame to dramatic film roles, from rock-inflected pop to dance floor resurrection, from tabloid obsession to elder stateswoman status, from being mocked as excessive to being celebrated as visionary. Her career did not move in a straight line. It moved like a storm, unpredictable, sometimes chaotic, sometimes destructive, but impossible to ignore. And storms leave marks. Cher's life has left marks on music, on fashion, on film, on celebrity culture, and on the way audiences think about female reinvention. Many artists today build careers around concepts Cher lived before they were strategies. The dramatic image, the eras, the comeback, the refusal to separate vulnerability from spectacle, the use of fashion as identity, the ability to speak directly to outsiders, misfits, women who have been underestimated, and fans who need someone larger than life to make their own lives feel survivable. That connection is not accidental. Cher has always belonged to people who felt like they did not fit. Maybe because she never fully fit either. She was too unusual for traditional beauty standards, then too beautiful to be taken seriously. Too funny to be considered deep, then too emotional to be dismissed as merely funny. Too glamorous to be ordinary, too ordinary in her wounds to be entirely untouchable. She existed between categories, and that is where many of her fans found themselves too. So they stayed with her. They stayed through eras, through albums, through films, through fashion transformations, through public controversies, through silences, through comebacks, through the years when the industry seemed unsure what to do with her. And now, as she stands at 80, those fans are not only celebrating a celebrity, they are honoring a relationship with time itself. Because Cher has been there for the soundtrack of many lives. Her songs played at first loves, heartbreaks, road trips, family living rooms, clubs, weddings, lonely nights, and moments when people needed to believe they could begin again. Her films gave people characters who were flawed, funny, bruised, and alive. Her interviews gave people permission to be blunt. Her image gave people permission to be dramatic. Her survival gave people permission to keep going. That is why this chapter feels so emotional. At 80, Cher is no longer only telling her own story. She is carrying the memories of millions who attached pieces of their own lives to hers. When they see her now, they remember themselves younger. They remember parents who watched her, friends who danced to her music, partners they lost, dreams they outgrew, versions of themselves that no longer exist except in memory. Cher becomes a bridge between youth and age, between spectacle and truth, between the person someone used to be and the person they are still becoming. That is a rare role for any artist to occupy, and it explains why people respond to her with such intense emotion. They are not simply afraid of losing a star. They are afraid of losing a witness to their own lives. But Cher's story does not ask us to stay afraid. It asks us to recognize the beauty of continuation. The beauty of a woman who has lived loudly, loved imperfectly, grieved privately, fought publicly, and still refuses to let anyone else define the last chapter. It asks us to stop treating age as a tragedy and start seeing it as evidence. Evidence of battles fought. Evidence of storms survived. Evidence of mornings that came after nights people never saw. So what happened to Cher at 80? She became what she had always been becoming. Not just a singer, not just an actress, not just a fashion icon, not just a comeback queen. She became a symbol of the one thing fame can never fake, endurance over time. And if seeing her now makes people cry, perhaps it is not because she is fading. Perhaps it is because she is still here, still unmistakable, still unfinished. And after everything life placed in her path, that is more moving than any tragedy could ever be. and unfinished is exactly what makes Cher so compelling. Because for most people, reaching 80 is treated like an arrival. A final platform from which one looks backward, counts the memories, and accepts the shape of what has already been. But Cher has never lived like someone interested only in looking back. Even when she reflects on the past, she does it with the energy of someone still arguing with it, still learning from it, still refusing to let it become the only story. That is why her memoir mattered so much. When Cher began putting her life into her own words, it was not simply another celebrity book. It was an act of reclamation. For decades, other people had told versions of her story. Journalists wrote about her marriages, critics wrote about her performances, tabloids wrote about her relationships, fans wrote about her legend, and strangers online wrote about her face, her body, her choices, and her age. But a life that public can never fully be understood from the outside. A memoir allows the woman behind the myth to speak. And for Cher, speaking has always been dangerous, funny, messy, and necessary. She has never been the kind of celebrity who hides behind perfectly polished sentences. Her honesty has edges. Sometimes it is blunt. Sometimes it is chaotic. Sometimes it arrives like a joke and lands like a confession. That is part of why audiences believe her. She does not sound like a machine trained to protect a brand. She sounds like someone who has seen too much to waste time pretending. At 80, that kind of honesty becomes even more valuable. Because age can strip away certain illusions. It can make people less interested in performing politeness for those who never protected them. It can make the truth feel more urgent. Cher has lived long enough to know that public approval is unstable, beauty is debated, careers rise and fall, and even the people who seem permanent can disappear. What remains is the story a person is brave enough to tell about themselves. And Cher's story is not tidy. That is why it feels real. There are chapters of ambition and chapters of fear, chapters of love and chapters of control, chapters of triumph and chapters of humiliation, chapters where she was adored and chapters where she had to fight to be taken seriously. She has been both powerful and powerless, glamorous and wounded, independent and vulnerable, celebrated and ridiculed. The temptation with legends is to smooth out the contradictions, but Cher's contradictions are the point. She is not inspiring because she lived perfectly. She is inspiring because she kept rebuilding from imperfect pieces. That is the truth many fans connect with most deeply. People do not look at Cher and see a life they can copy. Very few people will know that scale of fame, wealth, attention, or cultural influence. But they understand the emotional pattern. They understand what it means to be underestimated. They understand what it means to outgrow a version of themselves. They understand what it means to be criticized for changing and trapped if they do, not change. They understand what it means to laugh, because crying would reveal too much. Cher's life is extraordinary, but the feelings beneath it are human. And at 80, those feelings come closer to the surface. There is something almost sacred about watching someone who has been famous for so long continue to reveal new layers. Many stars harden into their image. They repeat the same stories, the same gestures, the same mythology until the public can predict every note. But Cher remains strangely alive in the telling. She can still surprise people. She can still contradict herself. She can still seem both proud and wounded by the same memory. That is not weakness. That is evidence that the past is still alive inside her. The past is never as finished as people pretend. For Cher, the past includes the young woman who became famous before she fully understood fame. It includes the marriage that gave her a platform and a cage. It includes the performances that made her beloved, and the business arrangements that made her feel controlled. It includes the men she loved, the mistakes she survived, the family pain she carried, and the professional battles that sharpened her instincts. It also includes all the moments when she won. And Cher won more often than her critics ever expected. She won when she broke free from the idea that she needed Sonny to matter. She won when she turned a television personality into a solo icon. She won when she entered film and proved she could hold the screen with emotional truth. She won when she became a fashion reference point for generations who came after her. She won when Believe introduced her to listeners who had not even been alive during her earliest hits. She won when the industry that once dismissed her had no choice but to honor her longevity. But perhaps the greatest win was quieter. She did not let bitterness become her identity. That does not mean she forgot. Cher has never seemed like someone who forgets easily. But there is a difference between remembering and being imprisoned. She remembers with bite, with humor, with occasional sadness, and sometimes with anger. Yet she did not allow the unfairness of her life to become the whole story. She kept making room for delight, for fashion, for romance, for performance, for jokes, for outrageousness, for the possibility that another chapter could still surprise her. That is a rare kind of resilience. Many people survive and become smaller. Cher survived and remained expansive. At 80, that expansiveness is what moves people. She still seems connected to appetite. Appetite for beauty, for laughter, for expression, for being seen, for telling the truth in her own strange rhythm. In a culture that often treats older women as if desire should expire, Cher's continued vividness feels almost rebellious. She reminds people that age may change the body, but it does not automatically extinguish personality, passion, humor, vanity, curiosity, or longing. This is why the emotional reaction to Cher at 80 is not only about nostalgia, it is about possibility. She shows that a life can have many acts, not just 2 or 3, but act after act after act, each one different, each one carrying the marks of what came before. She shows that reinvention is not always a young person's game. Sometimes reinvention becomes more meaningful with age because there is more history to transform. She shows that being misunderstood does not mean being wrong. Sometimes it means the world needs time to catch up. And the world did catch up to Cher. It caught up to the fashion. It caught up to the attitude. It caught up to the idea that a woman could be funny, sexual, ambitious, emotional, commanding, imperfect, and still worthy of respect. It caught up to the truth that spectacle and substance are not enemies. It caught up to the understanding that Cher had been more than entertainment all along. She had been a warning to every system that tried to make women smaller. A warning wrapped in rhinestones. A warning with a contralto voice. A warning that smiled, rolled its eyes, and kept going. So when people ask what happened to Cher at 80, maybe the answer is not that something happened suddenly. Maybe the answer is that everything happened slowly. Every heartbreak, every comeback, every reinvention, every goodbye, every standing ovation, every insult, every risk, every loss, every performance, all of it accumulated into the woman she's now, and that is why the sight of her can bring tears. Not because the story is ending, but because it is almost impossible to comprehend how much living one person can carry and still shine.